The year was 1886, in a soot-stained corner of Manchester, England. Fog clung to the cobblestones like a second skin, swallowing the sound of carriage wheels and muffling the cries of market vendors as if the city itself did not wish to be overheard. Inside a narrow brick house on Wither Lane, a boy sat hunched over a wooden desk. His name was Edwin Harrow, 13 years old, slight in frame, with eyes that seemed too heavy for his face. Edwin was unlike other boys his age. While they played marbles and raced in the street, he filled his notebooks with columns of numbers and sketches of human anatomy copied from old medical pamphlets. His fascination had not begun with idle curiosity, but with a death. His sister Clara, only 9, had taken ill one winter's night and passed before dawn. The doctor had called it consumption. But Edwin, in his child's defiance, believed there must have been a miscalculation, something that could have been predicted, corrected, solved. Each night since, he sharpened his quills, dipped them in black ink and charted the patterns of mortality. He tracked the age of the dead noted in obituaries, compared them to the weather on the day of their passing, even tried to measure how long bodies lay in the cemetery before the first signs of decay. To Edwin, grief had transformed into arithmetic. His mother, pale and exhausted, could not bear to scold him. His father, a factory overseer, muttered that the boy was morbid, unfit for proper life. Yet Edwin pressed on, whispering to himself as he worked, "If death is a certainty, then so is its order. Every order has rules. Every rule can be broken." The house itself seemed to conspire in his obsession. The floors groaned under invisible footsteps at night. Clara's room remained locked, yet Edwin swore he sometimes heard faint scratching at the door, like fingernails against wood. He recorded these sounds in the margins of his notebooks, marking the time and weather as though they, too, were entries in his grand equation of mortality. Neighbors began to talk. A child seen at midnight in the graveyard, counting the rows of headstones with a lantern in hand. A boy staring at coffins carried into St. Mark's, lips moving silently as if reciting sums. He became known as the Little Undertaker among crueler schoolchildren. Yet Edwin seemed untouched by mockery. For each jest he sharpened another quill, filled another page and calculated deeper. But death in 1886 was not a distant concept. Disease bloomed in the alleys, cholera swept through the city, and funerals crowded the churchyard. Every passing week delivered more data to Edwin's hands. He began to predict the likely ages of neighbors, even the likelihood of his father surviving the next factory outbreak of fever. It was on a damp October evening that his mother found a page that made her shudder. It listed her name beside a series of figures, her age, her diet, the hours she slept, and at the end an estimated year of death, 1888. She tore the paper in trembling fury, demanding Edwin cease his madness. But the boy only stared at her with calm certainty and said, "It is not madness. It is mathematics. You will see." And in those words there was something chilling, not in their defiance but in their conviction. The following days grew stranger still. Edwin began sitting by candlelight beside the family clock, watching the pendulum swing. Every breath he took he matched to its rhythm. He counted heartbeats, measuring the seconds between pulses, as though he might catch the precise moment life shifted to death. In school, his teachers found his arithmetic notebooks filled with not problems of sums, but calculations of breath, heartbeats, and rates of decay. One master struck him across the knuckles and demanded to know why he wasted his God-given talent. Edwin, without lifting his gaze, replied, "Because numbers do not lie even when God does." The room fell silent, for such words in 1886 bordered on blasphemy. Yet no punishment seemed to rattle him. He only worked harder, staring at the candle flame during lessons, watching it flicker as if it carried the soul of a dying man. One November night, as the fog swallowed Wither Lane whole, Edwin slipped from his house with his lantern. He carried no toys, no books, only his quill, a notebook, and a small pocket knife. The cemetery gate squealed as he pushed it open. He paced the rows, whispering numbers under his breath, calculating, always calculating. Finally he stopped before a fresh grave. The soil was still loose, the wooden marker bearing only the initials of a woman dead 3 days. And then he began to dig. Not in frantic desecration, but in measured strokes like a boy solving an equation line by line. What drove him that night? Grief, madness, or genius? No one could say. But the sound of his spade striking wood was not the end of his calculation. It was only the beginning of something far darker, something whispered about for years after in Manchester's foggy streets. The graveyard was silent except for Edwin's steady breaths and the scrape of soil against his lantern glow. When at last his spade struck the coffin lid, He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. For a moment his courage faltered. The scent of damp earth thickened, mingled with something faint and sour seeping from the disturbed grave. Yet he did not recoil. Instead he leaned closer, pressing his ear against the wood. He listened. What did he expect? A knock from inside. A whisper? Proof that death was a miscalculation, a premature burial, as he had begun to suspect? For weeks he had collected stories of mourners hearing faint cries beneath the soil, of bodies found twisted in coffins, nails broken from scratching against the lid. Edwin believed Clara might have been one of them, that death, as people called it, was sometimes nothing more than a sleep mistaken for eternity. But the wood gave no reply. He pried it open with his pocket knife inch by inch until a gap widened. A faint hiss of released air escaped like a dying breath. Inside lay the woman, her face already sinking into shadow, her hands folded as though she slept. Edwin did not scream. Instead he lifted his notebook, scribbling observations. The skin tone, the rigidity, the hours since burial. Numbers steadied him when terror might have broken him. Unseen behind him, the caretaker of St. Mark's Cemetery had been making his rounds. At the sight of a boy bent over a broken coffin, the man's lantern clattered to the ground. His shout echoed against the gravestones. Grave robber. Devil's child. Edwin froze. Before he could flee, the caretaker seized him by the collar, dragging him toward the church vestry. His protests, "I wasn't stealing, I was studying," only inflamed the man's disgust. By morning the town knew of Edwin's desecration. Rumors spread like fire in the fog. Mothers whispered of a boy who courted the dead. Children crossed themselves when he passed, calling him Death's apprentice. His school expelled him within the week. His father, humiliated, struck him so hard that Edwin stumbled into a chair. His mother wept, torn between fear for her son's soul and pity for the grief that had driven him to such madness. Yet Edwin remained unshaken. He told anyone who would listen that death was misunderstood, that too many were buried alive, mistaken for corpses. He claimed he could prove it, that his equations revealed patterns unseen by physicians. But no one wanted to listen. Instead, the town began to fear him. In Manchester's alleys, whispers grew. Livestock found dead with their throats slit, their hearts cut out and missing. Children swore they saw Edwin near the butcher's, staring at carcasses as if they were puzzles to be solved. The constable dismissed the stories as childish fancies, yet unease lingered. And then his predictions began. When Mr. Keats, an elderly bookseller, coughed blood into his handkerchief one Sunday, Edwin approached him on the street and said softly, "You won't see Christmas." The old man died 2 weeks later. At the funeral, Edwin stood at the back, silent, as though merely confirming a solved equation. Soon after, he began leaving folded slips of paper on neighbors' doorsteps, names, ages, and an estimated date of death. Some dismissed it as cruel pranks. Others, when his predictions came true, fell into terror. Doors slammed when he walked by. Children hid. Mothers clutched their rosaries. But Edwin was not satisfied. His notebooks grew thicker, his calculations more elaborate. He recorded not just deaths, but dreams, sudden silences in rooms, the patterns of birds circling above chimneys. To him, every omen was a number in his grand equation. And yet, the one death he most sought to solve, his sister Clara's, remained unsolved. Why had she gone so quickly? Why had the doctor failed? Where had the numbers gone wrong? It was in December, the snow blanketing Wither Lane in a muffled white, that his obsession took a darker turn. His mother fell ill, weakness in her chest, a fever that left her shivering. Edwin sat at her bedside, watching every breath, measuring the intervals, scribbling furiously. When his father begged him to fetch the doctor, Edwin shook his head. No doctor can help. Only numbers can. His father struck him again, sending him reeling, but Edwin clung to his quill. Night after night, he kept vigil by the sickbed, whispering equations under his breath, as though calculation itself could hold death at bay. But the fever worsened, and with every cough his mother's breaths grew shallower. Neighbors recalled the sight. A boy crouched beside his mother's bed, scribbling even as she moaned in delirium. When she finally slipped into stillness, Edwin's screams split the night, not of grief but of rage. He tore the pages from his notebook, scattering them across the room. The numbers are wrong. They should never be wrong. From that night, something in him changed. The boy who had studied death as though it were arithmetic now pursued it with the hunger of a fanatic. If the numbers failed him, then perhaps death itself must be interrogated, forced to reveal its secrets. And so, in the weeks that followed, Neighbors once again glimpsed Edwin's lantern in the cemetery. They swore they saw him kneeling over graves, muttering incantations of sums and figures. Some claimed he spoke to the dead, listening for answers only he could hear. Others whispered he had made a pact, that death, tired of being measured, had begun to answer back. The final straw came when a child in the neighborhood vanished, a girl of 7. Her body was never found, but some swore they saw Edwin with his lantern near the old stone crypt the very night she disappeared. Constables searched his home, finding nothing but endless notebooks filled with figures, equations and sketches of bones. But the whispers remained. By the turn of the year, Edwin Harrow was no longer merely a curiosity. He had become a figure of dread. Some called him a genius lost to madness. Others called him a heretic, an acolyte of death itself. Yet the boy, pale and gaunt, kept scribbling, whispering, calculating. For he believed he was close, so very close, to uncovering the one formula that mattered. The formula for immortality. By the winter of 1887, the boy named Edwin Harrow was no longer seen as merely peculiar. His gaunt frame, his hollow eyes, the smudges of ink that stained his fingers and cheek. He looked less like a scholar and more like one of the corpses he studied. Yet he wandered Manchester streets with a lantern, whispering calculations as though the snowflakes themselves answered him back. In his notebooks, he had begun to describe his great discovery. Death, he claimed, was not chaos, it was a sequence. The moment of the last breath, the hour of the final heartbeat, could be foreseen as surely as the trajectory of a falling stone. But his writings no longer stopped there. He had begun sketching diagrams of open bodies, lungs weighed against hours, hearts measured against days. And in the margins, frantic notations. Error in Clara's case. Error in Mother's case. Error must be corrected. The townspeople whispered of missing animals, of shadows moving in the graveyard at unholy hours. Mothers forbade their children from speaking his name aloud. Men spoke of sending him to an asylum, though none dared confront him directly. For all their fear, they believed his gaze carried a curse, that to draw his notice was to have one's name marked in his book of deaths. It was in early March that the constables finally acted. The crypt near St. Mark's had long been shuttered, its door bolted and its windows bricked. Yet one bitter morning, smoke was seen curling from its cracks. When the constables forced the door open, the scene inside froze even the most hardened among them. Rows of notebooks covered the stone floor, stacked high like walls. Candles guttered low, their wax pooling onto the lids of open coffins. And at the crypt's center, Edwin knelt before a slab. Upon it lay the body of a woman, though no one could tell from whence she had been taken. Her chest had been cut open, her heart removed, and beside her body, Edwin had scrawled equations onto the stone in her blood. He did not resist when they dragged him out. He did not scream, nor beg, nor explain. He merely repeated one phrase over and over, "I was so close. So close." The trial that followed was swift. The judge, grim-faced and weary of the gossip that had infected the city for months, declared Edwin guilty of desecration and unholy practices. Some urged the gallows. Others urged confinement. In the end, he was sent to an asylum on the city's outskirts, a crumbling building where silence hung thicker than plaster dust. Yet if the town expected his story to end there, they were mistaken. In the asylum, Edwin did not wither. He thrived. Denied his notebooks, he carved equations into the walls with his fingernails. Denied candles, he traced invisible formulas in the air, whispering sums in the dark. Attendants reported strange occurrences, patients convulsing in their sleep, corpses in the morgue twitching long after death. Some claimed Edwin's mutterings echoed through the halls even when his cell was locked and his lips were still. And then came the deaths. First a ward attendant, found stiff and pale, his eyes wide open as though frozen in terror. Then another days later. Soon the asylum was struck by a string of unexplained demises, each one of them whispered about in Edwin's cell the night before. "Tomorrow the tall one will fall," he was heard saying. And the tall attendant did, his heart failing without cause. The doctors were baffled, the chaplain horrified. But Edwin only smiled, his teeth gleaming through the shadows of his gaunt face. "The numbers are never wrong now," he told the chaplain. "I corrected the errors." Rumors spread beyond the asylum walls. Some claimed Edwin had become death's apprentice in truth, his calculations turning into commandments. Others whispered he was no longer human, that he had bartered away his soul for a ledger where every life's ending could be tallied. Parents frightened their children with his name, saying, "Behave or Edwin Harrow will write your number." By autumn the asylum burned to the ground. Some said a patient had started the fire in madness. Others swore it was Edwin himself, striking a match with a calm hand, content to vanish into smoke with his equations complete. His body was never found. Only fragments of notebooks remained, pages warped with soot and water, the ink smeared yet legible. On the final page, written in a hand jagged but triumphant, were the words, "The sum is complete. Death is not the end. Death is the equation." To this day in Manchester's fog, they say if you walk too near St. Mark's on a cold night, you may hear the scratch of a quill against paper, the whisper of numbers floating through the dark. And if Edwin Harrow writes your name in his invisible book, no prayer, no medicine, no pleading will change the sum. For he was the boy who studied death like mathematics, and perhaps, in the end, became the proof of his own theorem. If this story chilled you, don't forget to like this video. It helps us bring more forgotten tales to light.